Thank you, Dan. That was very, very informative, and you are very close to the issues of famine. I'm sort of one step removed. I work really in a different time frame and in a different scale. The time frame that Dan's talking about is on weeks and months and years, and I want to talk about the trends that are decades and maybe longer. And how that affects some of the factors here. I became very intrigued with sustainable development when it was first announced by the Brundtland Commission in 1987. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present generation without depriving future generations of their ability to meet their needs. So it's about us and it's about the future. When you're facing famine, it's about us. Now, there will not be a future if we don't survive. Pretty understandable. I can't think of anything worse than seeing my children starve. It must be horrendous to be in that situation. There is no question that it's difficult to do sustainable development in the best of circumstances. Even to meet one's present needs, it's impossible to do that or think about the future when you're in the context that Dan has been describing. On the other hand, if we don't think about the longer term, we will have many more of these kinds of situations because some of these are set off by droughts, by changes in weather events. In fact, it is argued that one of the main causes of the conflict in Syria was, I forget, 4 years, something like that, of extreme, unusual drought, which drove half the agricultural population off the land in Syria, unable to meet their needs. That led to the calls for to oust Assad, and here we are, how many, 7 years later, 8 years later, it's on and on and on. It all began with a lack of water. I want to say first something about water. There is one place where population and resources really do interact in a neo-Malthusian sense, and that is water availability per person, which has been going down both because there are more people who need water in all of this part of the world we're talking about, and it is being used. We're getting to they are getting to the point of using the water that is less accessible because all of that, so much of that which is accessible has been taken. The draining of aquifers, for example, which, by the way, we're doing in the United States as well. We will be probably out of water and out of corn in some of the high plains corn production regions maybe by mid-century. So we're not doing this much better. We were just given a better and a greater resource to begin with a much smaller population demanding it. And so that's the interplay that I see. There's an interesting correlation between the most water-deprived parts of the world. If you look at water per person, I had a doctoral student several years ago, Ned Spang, who was able to get data for something like 178 countries of every parameter you can imagine about water in all of its forms: groundwater, surface water, use for agriculture, use for power production, use for domestic use, and so on. And he found some really interesting relationships across the world. The most water-deprived per person country in the world happens to be Yemen. It's also a country that is in total chaos and has been for a great amount of time. It's kind of hard to untangle what causes what in this relationship. Let's just put them all together, let's all put them in the pot and make it a stew. It's a stew of factors that are causing famine. Yemen is also, there's an enormous amount of famine in Yemen as well, but it's so outside of our ability to address, given the instability there, that it kind of just gets ignored, I think, written off. we cannot keep using water in the inefficient or low productivity way that that is being used in the world. And in the poorest countries, it is used, it is an absolute necessity for all of us, but in poorer parts of the world, there is less capacity to use it more efficiently. I mean, just contrast the incredible efficiency with which water is used in Israel for agriculture and the inefficiency in every Arab country that neighbors it. Capacity, technological capacity, has a role to play, but eventually we're going to run out of that. In other words, our ability to innovate and increase productive use of water will not grow as fast as the demand for it at some point. So what do? Well, those of us in the West think that, globalization is kind of cool because if we can't get it here, we'll get it over there. Until the president puts trade bans on everybody and we can't get anything anymore. But that's probably a shorter term problem. In poorer parts of the world, and I don't wish to pretend to be an expert when I'm sitting next to one right here, but in many of the parts of the world, a lot of Africa, for example, there is still a lot of subsistence agriculture. Subsistence agriculture depends on local water. So if there's a local drought, there is local starvation. People can't get food. In 2012, I was a co-author of a report for UNEP looking at future demand for food as opposed to supplying the growing population who will be here. The question was, what will the demand be in 2050, say, and what might influence that? And one of the things that we found was that in Africa loses more food to waste between the time it is harvested and the time it could be eaten than any other part of the world. This is a storage problem. It is a management problem. In fact, the numbers were stunning. There is more food wasted in that process than is imported into Africa. We heard that food is imported. It is, to a lot of countries. But Africa would not need to import any food if it could manage its waste problem. Our waste problem is different. Our waste problem is between the grocery store and hopefully the compost pile. But for money, it's the garbage disposal. Something like 40% of the food we buy gets wasted in this country. Look at restaurants, look at supermarkets throwing out perfectly good produce because it has a little blemish on it or something. In countries in Africa, it's a totally different problem. It's the weevils and the mice and the rats and the cockroaches and everything else that destroy the crops, in storage. So there are many ways we can approach this problem, is what I'm just suggesting here. I'm not putting blame on any one of these or causality to any one of these as the total cause, but there's so many pieces of this that can be put together. And then there's the change in the weather, the droughts. What does that have to do with climate change? Well, it's interesting to note, if you look at trends, that indeed, particularly parts of the Middle East, Africa, parts of the American West have become much drier and much more prone to drought and more intense drought, higher temperatures, all of which decrease agricultural productivity, food production. In fact, we are seeing a decrease. The grain that feeds the most people in the world is rice. Rice production is decreasing, and it correlates almost perfectly with the rise in nighttime temperatures in the parts of the world where rice is grown, Southeast Asia, South Asia, China, and so on. Why is that? Well, plants, as you know, only grow during the day. It takes solar energy for them to grow. You need sunlight and fourth grade knowledge of photosynthesis to understand what's going on here. Sunlight, water, carbon dioxide leads to growing plants. But plants, while they are growing, are also living, which means they are using the material in the grain that they are making, or let's say the grain, let's keep it to rice, to stay alive, to grow. It takes energy. And they continue to do that at nighttime, even when they're not making more. And as temperatures rise, the rate of respiration goes up. And so therefore, they use the grain that they've just stored at night to grow faster. They try to grow faster. But they overdo it. And the net result is a loss in productivity of the most important grain in the world. And that applies to many other things as well. Rice happens to be studied better than most because of the International Rice Institute. Has the climate really changed? Are we living in a different climate? People often ask, did climate change cause a famine? That's a ridiculous question. Climate change doesn't cause anything. It's not a verb, it's a noun, right? It's a noun. Climate change is a thing. It's a condition. And the question is, did something change to alter the climate so that we are living in a different climate than we were before? To bring it closer to home, since when have you seen a hurricane drop 5 feet of water in 2 days on one place? Well, that's what happened in Hurricane Harvey in Houston. How did that happen? Well, the weather people, the meteorologists will tell you, well, there was a stationary front on both sides and it couldn't move. So it was just a freak that it happened there. What's a front? What's a stationary front? Stationary front is the leading edge of the jet stream. The jet stream stagnated. Why is the jet stream stagnating? Well, it looks like it's stagnating because we have melted half the ice in the Arctic Ocean. That's let the air above the Arctic Ocean be warmer. It's in touch with water at the freezing point rather than ice at minus 40. And therefore, the difference in temperature between the North Pole and us is less than before. So the air that spills down and is the jet stream doesn't spill down as rapidly as it used to. And therefore, we're getting these strange behaviors. How did we go from winter to summer in one day, right? At my home out in Williamstown, on May 1st, I had 2 patches of snow on either side of my front door on May 1st, right? 2 days later, it was 80 degrees. How does that happen? Well, it happens because when the jet stream loops down like this and you are here, it's cold. When the jet stream goes up like this and you are here, it's warm. The jet stream rotates around. All it has to do, that edge just has to move across us as this did, and we get this dramatic change. We live in a different climate than was here 25 years ago. So it's not that climate change caused anything, it's that climate change is the result of things we have done, like put carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. If I could plug something, I and 12 colleagues just got an op-ed posted in the New York Times yesterday on climate change and bioenergy, burning wood to make electricity, and why that's a bad idea, and how it undermines our attempts to address climate change. So we are causing many of these problems ourselves. The way we manage our water, the access to water, making the technology available, changing the climate, which makes water less available in many places than before, although it makes it more available when we don't want it in these very intense precipitation events. Just to give you an idea, we in the Northeast have experienced, well, four nor'easters, right, in March. It turns out that the average amount of precipitation in the Northeast U.S. has not increased or changed by much over the last 100 years. But the amount that appears in the top 1% of precipitation events, meaning snow or rain, is 71% greater than it was in the 1950s. That's a different climate. It means we get deluges. When it rains, it pours. So we're responsible, in part, for some of the things that are happening in the world of famine. So let me just conclude by saying that I certainly agree with Dan. It's this chaos and instability and conflict and so forth that is part of the problem. The inability, poverty obviously is a problem. If you're doing just subsistence agriculture, you can't put away much for you don't say a rainy day, a dry day when you really need it. And there are many human, social, and economic factors that are causing this. But in the longer-term trend, we need to keep our eye on these other aspects of water and climate. Thank you.